Hey there. If you have found this channel, you are probably someone who thinks deeply about life, growth, and ultimately the human mind. And you might have noticed something that some people rarely ever notice. And by the time they do, likely it's a little too late. And one of the common things about you is even when you understand what you should do, it's still hard to change. We can read the books, we can read the podcast, we can learn the ins and outs of psychology, and yet sometimes we still feel like a part of us keeps coming back to some of these same patterns. Now, that is why I've created this channel. This channel is for people who, like you, want to understand why and do something meaningful about it. We are evolvers, we take action, and that is what Eve Evolve Ventures with Amelia is here to do. So welcome back. And I'm excited to dig into today's topic, episode 2, which is that walk from shame to compassion, why it matters, and when you are someone who wants to change but is struggling in that pattern, why is that? What is it that you keep coming back to? And ultimately, what is that anchor point that kind of feels like it's weighing you down again and again, no matter what it is that you want to change or how it is that you try to approach that? So today I'm going to share a couple of concepts that I hope are helpful and share with you why this matters for you and your growth journey, which in our last episode number 1, we talked about the growth journey and how I had a client from the NFL who, after he stepped off the field and essentially hung up his jersey, tried to share with me, Amelia, I want to become a film director and I want to create a film. And yet I'm still struggling to get out of bed. So what is going on here? And what I shared with you is the fact that the growth journey is this process that no matter where you are, it's important to acknowledge that starting point. So you might have been at a whole different phase of your life by the time that you find yourself on this channel. And you might have struggled in so many different ways that only you know the depths and the pain to how deeply that struggle is. Like my clients, when you get into that struggle or you're running from that thing that just seems to be over encompassing on the body, the mind, and the soul, you kind of feel like you're losing that spirit because you're trying to make change happen. And yet those patterns that your nervous system has embedded within it keep dragging you down. So in our last episode, I encouraged all the evolvers to, with this visual, to essentially put a pin in this map, what we refer to, and I'll continuously refer to in these episodes as the growth journey. And when we can put a pin in exactly where we are in this journey, that is so powerful, because what I found for clients, and what I hope is the same for you, is that when you can mark where you are, that becomes the first invitation to start where you are. So I'm going to add that visual to the screen to give us one more chance to take a glance at it. So by now you should see the growth journey. And the growth journey here on my right is that visual. The growth journey is just like a trek. I mentioned a mountain, as if you're hiking to this top of your mountain, whatever that is. We experience our whole trek very differently, but some of the patterns that we experience are very much the same. We start in this old world, territories that seem familiar, our comfort zone. We take a huge leap of faith into what is known as lonely land, where we feel so isolated, we feel alone, we don't really know what or how to do, and we might not have found our tribe yet to try to make that change. Maybe we're stepping outside of everything that we knew. And hopefully through this video and these series, you're able to consistently take those leaps of faith in alignment with your nervous system, in alignment with your values, and in alignment with your goals that you're aspiring towards. Up at the top of this growth journey for you, you're able to enter into what is known as New World. So this is that space where quite literally your nervous system is learning how to change by starting from where you are. So put a pin, and that's where today begins. So now when we are evolvers, when we are someone who is trying to change, what happens, like I said in the last video and where we ended, when you feel as though you're trying to change, you're reading all the books, you're listening to the podcast, maybe you might be taking additional courses, CEUs, who knows, you might have even gotten multiple degrees on something, and you're not having too much traction. It becomes one of the most difficult places to be, because what happens right in that space is that more often than not, we begin to do this very insidious thing called shaming ourselves. So what is shame? Why does it matter? And why the heck am I talking about it when it comes to this big old topic of growth, of changing, of evolving, and ultimately of moving through the patterns that end up becoming our prison? Shame is one of the biggest emotions that, through my time understanding the neurobiology of trauma, of change, and ultimately our neurophysiology and how emotions interact with our nervous system and change at large, shame becomes one of those big emotions that when it comes to change, you can't help talk about, because whether you try or try again and ultimately stop trying, somewhere or another, we come against this big pervasive emotion that riddles every human being. And ultimately, I have not seen one human being in our practice over thousands of people who have not had some run-in with shame. So let's just be real. Shame is a topic that it can be so big, but we're not going to talk about the big aspects of shame. What I want to start, and as we'll dig into even deeper throughout this series, is what is shame? Why does that matter? And how does it help us understand ourselves at a deeper level so that we can understand our patterns and then be able to walk the journey of compassion, which is the antidote to shame, which helps us open up to an embodied, safe version of change for ourselves. Now, shame ultimately, like I said, is an emotion. It's this emotion that has deep involvement with belief systems about ourselves. And this belief that we hold of ourselves, that we are flawed at the core of who we are, that we are unworthy, and ultimately that we are like this less than sentiment being. And what happens as a result of experiencing that belief and the emotion that results in that, what comes is shame, because of the perceived failure that we are, the perceived inadequacy that we experience or that we showcase, or some degree of violation of a social standard. So shame, in other words, is I am a bad person. I am bad. So at your core, you are a bad human being. Whereas guilt, which is slightly more adaptive and helpful for change, guilt is I did something that wasn't super in alignment with who I aspire to be, the journey that I tried to go to, the film that I want to create. So shame, that intense emotion, while it has evolutionary roots in our biology, when it comes to change and us actually trying to implement something different than what we're experiencing in our comfort zone, shame is that pervasive emotion that essentially shuts our nervous system down and becomes that hypervigilant scanner of evidence that picks up, that essentially puts on your back that you're bad, or any limiting belief about yourself when you try and change something. Shame is that emotion that just collects all of these experiences to tell you that you are not enough, that you are helpless, that you're inadequate, you're not lovable, it's too late, that life is too hard for you to be able to try and try again and experience failure. And it just brings so much into, if you imagine the wheels of change, it chalks those wheels up, sticks those sticks in. So eventually you just kind of stop. And that translates to a nervous system that ends up shutting down, freezing, etc. So why does talking about shame matter for this episode? Ultimately, I want to introduce shame because if we are not aware of how shame interacts in our nervous system, and we'll go through another episode about how our nervous system responds to shame, but if we don't know it exists, we cannot really start exactly where that shame is. So if I were to ask you to put a pin in that growth journey and then say, okay, let's start where you are. And shame comes in and essentially shuts you down and say, there's no bother. There's no reason we should get started. There's, at the end of the day, no matter what we try, we are bad. We do suck. And there's no changing that. We cannot really make that change because our nervous system doesn't feel safe to counteract that shame. And so none of us has been really taught this lesson that shame is something that comes to us very young, oftentimes before we're verbal. And so when we interact with change in our adult life or in our older years, for lack of better words, unless we've been taught the practice of compassion, specifically self-compassion, even more specific distal self-compassion, we will struggle to affect positive change within our lives. So what I want to invite you into is the invitation to start ultimately where you are. And yes, that means exactly where you are on the map. So the key underlying philosophical principle that I hold through every single call that I have with a client, every single sentiment that I have with another human being is that I hold the belief that you are enough how you are, where you are, as you are. In compassion, the growth journey, starting where you are, holds that belief as well. Why does that matter? Because most self-improvement or most books, like I said in the last episode, most content that you'll consume has this like underpinning sentiment that you aren't enough as you are. So only when you put in the reps, only after you finish the books, only after you finish going to those classes or reading that novel or whatever it is, only after do you actually have access to your enoughness. And so it kind of puts us in this really particular predicament where we have to do something or be something other than what we are, acknowledging there's a lack. And it's very confronting for our nervous system. So what do we do when we haven't been taught how to hold or garner or experience really to ourselves, offering ourselves compassion? Well, I'm going to encourage you to think about this. If your best friend or a really important member of your family called you and they were struggling through something, how would you respond to that? That's called proximate compassion, active listening, responding immediately with that level of I see you, I hear you, and I'm right here. That's compassion towards them. When we look at ourselves and we look at our changes and we look at where we want to change, we have to think about extending that same compassion towards ourselves. But right here and right now, we're thinking about our future selves. And that's called distal compassion, which essentially acknowledges the fact that we are enough as we are. And when shame comes up, when we are suffering, we have everything inside of us that we need in order to take another step, in order to vote for our version of ourselves that we believe are enough, that we believe are incredible, that we believe as it is whole. And so I want to introduce you to one of the individuals whose work has really influenced this work today. And her name is Pema Chodron. So you might have heard of her before. Ultimately, who is she and why do I mention her? Because her book right here, Start Where You Are, has really influenced this aspect of this work. She's an American-born Tibetan Buddhist. She's also a nun. She's this incredible human being that, honestly, her work just speaks tenfold to so many people's hearts, high performers, individuals who are seeking out that change, but griped by shame to the extent where compassion towards ourselves for that distant future version of ourselves, it's accessible. But what is compassion in the essence? And why does that help us move into the openness and embodiment of shame? The openness and embodiment of compassion, of change. Moving shame through compassion creates change. Compassion is this deep awareness of the suffering of others, but it's cultivated and coupled with ultimately this deep desire to alleviate it. So if we're thinking about we're the other person, when we're trying to change, it's the now version of ourselves, the future version of ourselves. Okay, both of those two things can be true at the same time, we can cultivate compassion towards ourselves, knowing that in the future, we're going to be struggling through getting outside of our comfort zone. So what does that struggle do? How does it impact us? And ultimately, what do we need in order to take the active steps to, like I said in the last episode, becoming compassionate, cultivating safety, and creating a trauma-informed safe space in order for us to grow and evolve? Acknowledging the fact that a lot of us have limiting beliefs is critical. But when we have a limiting belief, they tend to fall in one of three categories. I'm not enough, I can't, or I'm too late, essentially. Life is too hard for me. So they fall into three categories of worthlessness, of hopelessness, and of helplessness. And when we try to go activate our own change without having awareness of our shame response system, our nervous system, how unsafe change might feel to us, deep, deep, deep in those reservoirs where we need access to compassion to counteract and to be the antidote to shame, we then can move and take a step towards ourselves, not away from ourselves, but towards ourselves, acknowledging that we are enough now, we can, and we're not too late for whatever that change that we're seeking is. So non-judgmentalism, a lot easier said than practiced. Trust me, I know. And I'm all too familiar with this and how challenging it can be in practice. So the second visual that I want to share today, and as we begin to round today's episode out, is what is the 3 steps that we can all take today, inviting you into a practice of self-compassion in real time. So this is what I call the belief steps. Essentially, this is, when children, toddlers are taking their first step, there's a little bit of a fall, a little bit of fall forward and failure, and maybe there's some crying. What happens after that? They get up and try again. Now, babies don't have the 20 or 30 or 40 years plus experience, a decade experience that you might have watching this film or watching this episode, but ultimately, the concept is the same. Where does self-compassion enter into this equation? And how do we know how important this is? So what you're seeing here is what's called the wave of self-belief. And self-belief is essential for change. But it remains inaccessible when we have shame that is left unaddressed, or when we do not have a practice of self-compassion, inviting ourselves to start where we are in the change process. And when we have the ability through this episode to understand what compassion is, what self-compassion is, and we lean into that enoughness as we are and where we are, that pin on the growth journey, what this does is it starts to shift that shame to compassion. And belief is built through momentum. And there's 3 specific steps that we can do every single day, starting today, to move our belief, to move our shame through us, to have our nervous system feeling open to the next episode and the episodes thereafter, so that we can have an actual real change from a standpoint of safety, security, and embodied safety. The first step is stating to yourself. So right now, today, state to yourself something along the lines of that is believable and hopeful for you after you recognize that I am enough. I'm enough as I am, and I'm deserving of that self-compassion that Amelia talked about. And you state to yourself what it is that you want this episode to do for you. I'm stating that here I'm going to join Amelia in this self-compassion meditation. I'm going to notice where my breath is, and I'm just going to focus on that. So you state that, right? It's kind of like a promise to yourself, a little creed to yourself. That's step 1. And you can apply this with anything. Then you prove it to yourself. So these are those moments where compassion in action Go ahead and make that promise and then prove it to yourself. This is where we build trust with ourselves in our nervous system. So as I do this meditation, you're actually going to be focusing in on that breath. Very simple. But if you don't, it erodes self-trust. If you do, you build it. After that, what do? It's kind of like in kindergarten growing up, right? Get that pat on the shoulder, right? That 5-star if you did a good job. No one's rating this scorecard. No one is rating this scorecard. Only you are. And the scorecard is all about making sure that you're practicing compassion. And when you do, and you prove that to yourself, you're noticing your breath. What's called self-assigning is step number 3. Essentially giving that pat on your back. I did it. It seems so small and insignificant. But this really takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage, especially someone who has been very much the mighty, brave, courageous one in their entire life. Trust me, I have some of the most beefiest, toughest human beings that roll their eyes at me when I'm like, hey, this is the formula. Doing it in practice is so different. They're like, yeah, right, Amelia. There's no way this does anything. Give it a try. Okay. And we're going to end with a reflective, self-compassionate haiku of all things in order to have this shame move into self-compassion, where you state to yourself, this is that hope that you embody. You prove to yourself, and doing so develops this self-trust. And you have the courage to give yourself that pat on the back, which is after you've done that, this is that really good feeling, that dopamine surge that comes from when you've had the courage to do something different than what you have always done. And afterwards, you will feel this wave of self-belief. And applied again and again, this is your practice, even sometimes in the small things, that can really create a meaningful life that has shame transformed into compassion. And trust me, compassion is like the ninja warrior of change that so few people actually talk about. And it just so happens to be something that, like the growth journey, has been irrefutable at this point. And I could go into all the studies, all the science, but I'll leave that up to your part that wants to go study and research that. Also include some links below. So let's now close tonight together with an invitation to practice that self-compassion. So as you do, state to yourself where you're going to focus your breath. Prove it to yourself by doing that. And then once we're done, go ahead and give yourself that pat on the back. So first, shame whispers, not yet. Compassion steps in, says you are. Breathe. And begin right here. Okay. So this might seem super woo, but there's so much underneath this that simple does not inherently mean easy to practice. And as you notice yourself walking yourself through these belief steps, you can practice it in the car, to the gym, wherever you go. Some of the highest performers have had to, by force, create a compassionate, self-compassionate focus practice. So I don't want to do that by force by anyone that's joining this channel. I want to do it by invitation, because I know deep down the nervous system needs this. Because like I said at the very beginning, so many of us as human beings get riddled with shame. We don't even know what it is. We just know it's this pervasive feeling that shuts us down even before we get after change itself. So if this is something that you enjoyed, I am so grateful that you did. Would love to hear your feedback down in the comments. And if you want quieter reflections on this episode specifically, click the link in the show notes where I will share my personal reflections and a tactical application of this episode in your personal life. So as always, thank you for joining me on Eve, and I'm curious to see where this journey takes us. Let's keep evolving together and walk the path, starting where we are.